Craig Stewart, welcome back. It is Inspired Conversations. And well, look, if you have been following my channel, you know I'm very passionate about vitamin D. And I tell you what, boy, have I got a guest for you. She is appearing in social media conversations, conversations in real life, conversations here, there, and everywhere about a connection with vitamin D, sleep, the microbiome, and better health. Now, my background into this, ladies and gentlemen, is cluster headache, and I've previously seen, since 2015, amazing success in taking vitamin D at a level around 80 nanograms per milliliter. So you can imagine my surprise and interest when I came across Dr. Gominak's work a couple of years ago. There were so many synergies there that I just had to follow it further. Now, in this interview, I hope we're going to do it in a few parts. We're going to do a bit of a background and introduction. We're going to delve into the world of who actually is Stasha Gominak. How did she get into this? And in the third part, Walter Stumpf, and an interesting dude. We're going to talk about dosage and supplementation. Some of the often questions I get asked, we're going to put them to this very knowledgeable person. In part 5, genetics. It's something maybe she hasn't talked about a lot in her videos, so I'm going to probe her there, and it will lead into a conversation around cluster headache and migraine. We're going to talk a little bit about things from a New Zealand perspective, in particular around guidelines and toxicity. And we're going to finish up with a review, a philosophical round off with some interesting questions from the metaverse to Elon Musk to some somber thoughts and reflections. Now, Stasha Gominak, the body is designed to heal itself. The body remembers the repairs it needs to make. The body repairs itself in deep sleep. Humans no longer sleep as we used to because our sleep chemicals, our neurochemistry is out of whack. Our sleep chemicals are out of whack because our microbiome is out of whack. Our microbiome is out of whack because we no longer have the awesome foursome, the commensal species of bacteria that are yet sparsely covered in the literature, but they're starting to appear. Look, the awesome foursome are vacant, ladies and gentlemen, because we no longer have that intestinal vitamin D gut soup. And we don't have that intestinal gut soup because our lives have changed. We're no longer making vitamin D like we used to. Now, I preface those comments to say that there is a 5-minute video that explains deficiency almost perfectly put together by Henry Lahore. If you haven't seen that, I suggest you stop now and check that out, because it will just give you a window, a glance into understanding the conversation around deficiency. Now, in New Zealand, when we venture out into the sun, I tell you, we're afraid of it. We're so afraid of skin cancer down here that we cover ourselves top to toe in broad spectrum sunscreen. I tell you, it's all over the news. It's a slip, slop, and slap. We all know it. And rightfully or wrongly, this is the reason, amongst a number of other things, modern Western life that has resulted in our current situation. Now, am I wrong? Am I right? Have I followed your conversations correctly enough to have surmised things in such a few short sentences, Stasha?
I have to say, my daughter lives in now Adelaide, and she's been living in Melbourne for a while. I'm trying to say it like she does. I don't know how to pronounce it, but I've been exposed to the whole idea of the hole in the ozone. And if anything, the teaching and what I've seen when I'm in Australia is that you should always be covered up. And that's one of the struggles that we have. If you and I are really enthusiastic about D, is to try to have a conversation that doesn't negate what the dermatologists have told us, but to understand that when we covered our skin, we changed everything about our biology, and we warned people about it without really knowing the real depth of what would happen to us.
Mm. And so, you know, before we start to flesh out that sleep piece and really get into the background of this talk, Stasha, you know, we haven't really talked much about yourself, and I know folks are going to be interested, you know, like, why did you get into medicine? Why neurology? What's the background there?
Thank you for asking. I grew up in California, I love the sun. I grew up in Northern California in San Jose. It was a very rural place at the time. My age determines that I actually played outside. So my mother was very much into camping. In California, you can camp all the time. It doesn't rain very much. So we spent a lot of our time outdoors. And I think that a lot of my viewpoints are colored by what my own body was like. I think a lot of caregivers, I know I have a friend who is also a functional medicine specialist, and she's been sick since the whole time I've known her. And I think she views the body through the lens that we're born and then we just have various illnesses. And I don't view it that way. I view it that we're set here on this planet like every other animal. And if everything's okay, everything works until our 70s, and then we start to fall apart, because that was really my experience with my relatives. So I grew up in California, and then I was going to go into biochemistry, and I still am totally crazy about biochemistry. But what the life of the PhD chemist is really boring. They spend all of their time indoors. They never talk to anybody. They know more and more about less and less. So then I got into medicine, and I really like medicine, and I got into neurology because it's kind of like a puzzle. It's kind of like a wiring diagram. That my mind is really an engineering type of mind. In the modern day, I would have probably become an engineer instead of going into medicine. And then I went into medicine, and then I happened to fall into sleep. And the fascinating part about that is I had no formal training in sleep, which in retrospect makes me think I wasn't appropriately brainwashed about a certain way to look at it. So I kind of went into it with, well, it seems to me that what everybody else is writing about is not helping my patients. It's not that I want to step out of the groove. I think medicine, people who go into medicine are still extremely conservative people. We are not usually entrepreneurs or innovative or very creative people. And it's been really hard for me to do something that's against the grain of modern medicine. That's just not the way I'm put together. And I've had to do a lot of thinking about why that is.
I think we'll find similar views in the life of Walter Stumpf. In particular, one of the articles I found that he wrote today around the peer review. Peer review. You know the article. So look, I guess why neurology, and where did you practice?
I originally practiced in. I like neurology because we select in medicine where our personalities fit, and I'm kind of nerdy. Maybe mildly on the spectrum. Within neurologists, I'm normal, but I just fit there. And I really couldn't, the people that inspired me were other neurologists. So I went into that, and I really love neurology. And I practiced in the San Francisco Bay Area for several years, and then moved to Tyler, Texas in 2004. And then just did a general neurology practice. And I really what I like is talking to people and helping them feel better, and being curious about why they're not.
And so we've heard the story about how you got your background into the D stuff, and I guess that explorative path that you followed. Now, really curious to know what patient size kind of group are we talking about? A handful of people, hundreds, 200s. How many people have kind of followed this path through with you?
I estimated that it was 1,500, and I can't really say that all of them followed the same path, but I had over 1,000 people who were doing D levels on a regular basis, following them over a number of years. So I'm not really a scientist, and I'm not interested in setting up a study. And one of the reasons why I'm not is in medicine, you set up your study to make one variable move. That's not clinical practice. We're never one variable. So it's really trying to fit, let me say it a different way. Clinical trials now are set up in a certain way, but clinical medicine, when you're treating patients, is not a clinical trial. So when I have a very, very amazing result where many people come back and say, my sleep is better, and we have a scientific basis, and we have people who have low Ds, to me, that was important enough to make a commentary about, or at least an hypothesis to bring that to people's attention. And since we had nothing else to offer, especially to insomniacs, especially to people with cluster headache, things that I had no cures for, and I had crappy responses to the medicines, and I've been practicing for 25 years, who start to get significantly better. To me, that was like, oh my goodness, this is an amazing thing. People need to know about this. Medicine is not that accepting of clinical observation right now.
Absolutely. And I contrast your comments by saying, the neurologist I saw in 2015 was as astute as you are. And she went as far as saying, look, I've heard that vitamin D may be able to help, but I cannot help you with a dosage and whatnot, but it may be something to explore. So your tenacity and strength to kind of carry that forward to a patient group of around 1,500 people estimated is kind of remarkable in itself. And so when you kind of talk about—
Let me comment that my patients are the remarkable ones. Being willing to come back and say, you tried to do this and it didn't work, and being willing to say, I'll try going higher or doing something else. That's amazing.
Again, I say that it's amazing, given you struggle in New Zealand to find a family doctor or a neurologist that would stand by, look at labs and support a journey like the journey that we're talking about. So it worked, and it worked for a lot of those people.
Yes, and then there wasn't anything else. That's the frustrating thing, is I'm stuck with kind of making this mistake of going down this road and having all these sleep studies that just say, well, deep sleep just isn't there. They don't stop breathing. Okay, well, and I'm searching the literature and nobody's writing about it. That's kind of terrifying. And no one writes about insomnia except to blame.
Yeah, and so there was a paper I mentioned I was reading, and we can move back to that later, but I guess there was an influence in your life, and this moves on to the section about Walter Stumpf, because this gentleman, I did a bit of a deep dive a couple of weeks ago in preparing the agenda, and I was absolutely fascinated, and I understand you were fascinated and had a deep respect for this gentleman as well. We're talking about a gentleman that published a lot of literature across many decades. In fact, I'll bring it up on screen so you can actually see the breadth and width of what this gentleman was up to. So there's the screen share, Stasha. That's what I kind of pulled out. That's where I found the peer review article. Now, before we kind of start talking about the literature, just tell me a little bit about this guy.
This guy has been pivotal in my personal life for a couple of reasons. So what happens is two people come back and say, hey, that vitamin D made me sleep better, my headaches went away. So I get into his literature, and I actually, within a week or so, call him up and say, hey, you don't know me, but I have this clinical observation. You've been writing a lot about vitamin D. And I think the first article I read was actually a long review article that covered all sorts of GI tract stuff. I think it was titled the GI, but he put together this completely sensible belief system that's evolutionary based, that makes complete sense. And so I step into this from an interest in sleep, and then step into him as the explanatory legend, let's say. And I call him up and I start talking to him about it. And he's a little bit skeptical at first, but he says, sleep, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And no one's written about it. And this guy has an article that actually shows the vitamin D receptors in the actual nuclei that paralyze us. And I'm like, I don't know why you're even looking at that area, but that blows my mind. And then, I actually went and visited him and spent a weekend with him in his home. One of the really important things is that article peer review, because his history is such that I think that so I'm reading all this literature thinking there were hundreds of patients in my practice over the last 25 to 30 years that died because of vitamin D deficiency. This guy wrote the first sensible belief system surrounding it in 1982, which means it could have been taught to me in endocrinology when I was in medical school, and it would have changed my whole outlook about what was wrong. And the endocrinology practice had enveloped D as one of many hormones, I can think of many people who died horrible, painful deaths who would not have died. Now, having seen that, I'm looking at all this other literature, including up until today, where the authors are not looking at Walter's articles. They are still not seeing it through his lens. It's not that all of them are blind. It's that so many of them are blind. Then I go and I actually go to a meeting called, and stop me anytime this gets off topic for what you want, but yeah. I went to a meeting called the Vitamin D Workshop, and it's an annual meeting that they've had since the 70s, where anybody involved in vitamin D in any way, including lay people, can come and have their little dues, stand up and have a, you just ask if you want to present an article. So I went to the social things. We were at the aquarium in San Diego to try to talk to some of the big dogs who are writing the summary articles about why it is that Walter's point of view is so completely ignored. So we're sitting at this table after dinner, and I'm asking Bruce Hollis, who's someone I really respect. He's one of the few people who's done clinical trials. He's really an amazing guy. I don't know him, and I say, why is it that Walter's point of view has never really been embraced? And he says, well, Walter was really an asshole. He would stand up at these meetings and he would say, I'm the only one who really understands this. You guys don't reference me enough. And I'm thinking to myself, this is a social awkwardness. This is a problem of a human who doesn't know how to politically make his statement. So I actually have the same personality as Walter. I have been living in this resentful, how come nobody understands this sleep-D connection? And I watch this and I think, this guy is brilliant. He has done an amazing job, but this class-conscious group of primates react to his personality instead of his literature. And for me, that started an important journey. That's why I'm here with you.
I guess, and to give some scope for the viewers, Stasha, we're talking about a gentleman that was a prisoner of war at the age of 17. He was a paratrooper. He was held by the British, held in a camp in Belgium, spent a year there, and returned home to his mother to begin medical studies in 1946, and made his way over the wall, across the wall, around.
It was before the wall was actually built. That's
right.
How long ago it was.
And I'll bring it up on screen so you can just have a look at how researched and educated this guy was, and as well the article in and around the peer review process, which in a nutshell, Stasha is kind of saying, you guys just are not seeing what I'm seeing. There's no point even sharing my information with you because you're just not ready to see it. It's kind of
This was in response to his first set of articles, which was about estrogen receptors in the brain. And his colleagues said, well, of course there are no estrogen receptors in the brain. Like, how can you even say that? That's crazy.
And so please, before he started publishing more about vitamin D, he was talking about estrogen a lot in his papers, and he was involved alongside publishing about vitamin D, radiobiology and nuclear medicine. Now, just I'm an everyday dude, Stasha. What is that?
Oh, I'm thrilled that you want to ask about this. So Walter comes to this country, and let me just parenthetically add, so picture yourself, one, he's a Nazi, two, he's an obligate communist because he's living in East Berlin. And then he's in the Midwest in the US doing fellowship training with a heavy German accent. This is in the 1960s and 70s. This is not a good time to be a heavy German accent in the middle of the Cold War. So he's a small guy, and he really does have a big chip on his shoulder. He's a brilliant man, no question about it. He was also a neurologist in terms of his training, okay? So he has a few reasons to have a chip on his shoulder. Then, so when I'm talking to him about this, he says, oh, I come here, and we were really interested in seeing how did hormones make things happen? And this is before what all these things that we take for granted now. So the hormones come into the cell, and he said at the time, we had no way of imaging anything that passed into the nucleus. Like those of us who haven't really looked under a microscope, like the idea of being able to picture something floating into or being transported into the nucleus and then see what it's doing. So they're at the very beginning of vitamin D being taken into the nucleus, and they don't even know if there's a vitamin D receptor yet. And he's trying to image this in some way. And what they did was to actually label the vitamin D 125-OH, the active form, with a tritiated hydrogen. That tritiated hydrogen is very mildly radioactive. So they put that label on it. They let it go into the cell in many, many different types of cells, different parts of organs. And then they freeze it and section it extraordinarily thin. And then they layer it on with Kodak paper, the exact same paper that you would use to make a photograph. And that little tiny bit of radioactivity, after you leave it there for several weeks, makes a little black mark. And then you actually have to do what are called H&E stains, so you can see the anatomy of the cell. It's extraordinarily complicated. And you have to layer them to say, oh, that's the nucleus in the liver cell that's here. So you have to trace out the anatomy and then say it's here and here and here. And you have to do these amazingly special types of sections. And he got very, very, very good at that. And it was very hard to do. And as he got to the end of his career, nobody was using photo paper anymore. And nobody was really interested in these very difficult frozen section techniques. And so, but in the background, he's interested in this very engineering, physical kind of way in the technique. But the more impressive thing about him was, from my point of view, was that he had this watchmakers or watch repairmen's attention to detail, combined with this amazing ability to see the world in its whole. That's an unusual combination in my view. He got towards the end of his life and was reading and writing things about how every culture are really basically sun worshipers, because the sun, he got into heavy duty Chinese philosophy and how this relates in that and how it relates to Eastern medicine. He's a very, very interesting guy.
So I really was able to capture, I guess, the big picture. And so through this kind of technology that he developed, I get the feeling he glimpsed an overall picture of vitamin D and discovered, I guess, the receptors are not just located in the kind of classical pathway of calcium and phosphorus homeostasis.
Oh my God, he was totally bored with that. And he was, this vitamin D showed up on the planet when flowering plants came, way before animals. Flowering plants, like they don't have bones. Okay, so yeast, which doesn't have bones, makes D2 and is on the planet for billions of years. And then plants come and flowering plants come. That means there were plants before that didn't have two sexes, that didn't have to have two sexes that fertilized each other. So there's an aspect, and I don't know that Walter even knew that. Those are articles that are published more recently. The thing that's shocking about him is he just got the whole picture. He put it together and said, this is going to affect this, this, and this aspects, which we would have to quiet or delay when it's winter time. Duh, that's so obvious.
And so Walter has now passed, but you co-authored a paper with him before he passed, and I'll ensure the link is provided so you can go and read that, ladies and gentlemen, and just kind of get a glimpse into how fantastic and smart this gentleman was, and so it led to you having a really profound interest in sleep. And I'm going to put a quote up on screen for the folks at home now. Sleep is more like a symphony. So there's a symphony of this many violins, and there's a drummer, and there's a bass, and there's a trumpeter, and all of these guys have to have healthy, well-functioning instruments. Now, as you know, I run a vitamin D testing business here in New Zealand, Stasha, and one of the first things that people tell me as they start supplementing vitamin D is how good the sleep is. It's just like a comment I'll hear time and time again. I cannot remember the last time I was sleeping this well. So I also say that there are a whole bunch of Kiwis that are not sleeping so good. So there is an insomnia survey I'm going to put up on screen here, some statistics that really will shock you. So wake up 3 or more times during the night. That's roughly a third of us down here in New Zealand. A third of us, ladies and gentlemen, difficulty falling back to sleep. Half of us often wake too early in the morning. 40% of us never really wake feeling refreshed, 53% of us. So I tell you what, it's a conversation that certainly appears to have some merit around having. Now, talk to us about the symphony. I mean, I really did not realize it was this bad.
Well, as you imagine, these are made up stories. Okay, here's what I expected to happen. I find this one thing that's missing, and we give it to everybody, and everybody's happy, and it fixes everything. I thought it was going to be really simple, and it wasn't. So we all got a lot better, and then we got worse again, as though, oh, I'm happy with that, and we kept the level just where it should be, and then it seemed like the brain was lacking other things. Now, if you look at this through the current level of neuroscience, like if you open the most recent journal articles about what are all the nuclei doing, the actual pictures that they make have got like 32 arrows moving. They have REM on switches, REM off. So as soon as you can see all those arrows moving, the first thing you should realize is we don't have a clue. Okay, I mean, that's embarrassing and depressing, but we don't have a clue. We're watching all these things happen in animal models, and we're watching them on a single cell or a nuclear level where a clump of neurons are. And then I'm sitting with a patient. So I know that neural diagram, even though as fascinating it is to me, leaves me just overwhelmed as a neurologist. So as a patient not sleeping, it's 20 times as bad. Okay, now, then the next question is, will any of these people ever really get better? And then what really happens is I realize that each one of them has failed in their own specific way. We may have all failed in the same epidemic, but the way that we fail is affected by our own genetics. So some people have a dopamine issue, and some will have a serotonin issue, and all these other neurotransmitters that are at play. So what I learned was, one, it's not about giving a replacement chemical. It's about doing whatever you can to get this person sleeping. Even if it's not great sleep, it's better than no sleep. And then magically, some of them would come back a couple of years later and they're actually better. So it seemed to me in the background, there really was a helper. Like the brain really knew what it was supposed to do to make you better. But it wasn't going to send you an email telling you what its plan was for the next 3 months. Okay. So in endeavoring to get the patient to hang in there with me and recognize it as slow, steady steps in a single direction, because that's all we had, instead of saying, miracle drug, you're going to feel better in a week, I would make up these pictures to show that, well, we were doing well for 6 months. Well, we were doing better for 6 months. And then these 3 systems began to repair themselves, and they got up fully up to speed. And now this other thing's missing. And that's really never the way I had thought about biology of the brain. I never really thought about it. Oh, it gets better, it builds things, and then it runs out of, I don't know, it runs out of screws. It doesn't have the screws anymore. We have to go to Home Depot and buy the screws so we can go on. So the model of all the different parts is a better way for someone to understand so that they don't give up midway and say, well, that's great. I'm waking up 2 times instead of 4. I'm only getting up to pee once instead of 4. But this is not what I want. And to get them to be patient enough to say, gee, let those little guys in your brain have enough time, and keep in mind that your brain has to triage. I only have, maybe we've gotten up to an hour of deep sleep, an hour of deep sleep split between a half of slow wave sleep and a half of REM sleep. And during that time, it not only has to fix your sleep switches, it has to fix all the things in your heart, your lungs, your kidneys, all these things that you have no way of knowing what they're doing. So it's a tiny little bit of deep sleep that's actually trying to fix your sleep switches. So if you like the analogy, I'll keep using it. But it really did seem like, oh, I thought that I would just give these vitamins, like give pills, and all the sleep switches would just fall into line. Everybody would start playing in unison. And it wasn't like that. But it doesn't mean that it won't eventually happen if we're patient and we stay the course.
I mean, most folks won't even think there's anything wrong with waking up 2 or 3 times, to snack or to urinate throughout the night, which crazy stuff. And while we're talking about sleep, we're late getting stuff down here in New Zealand. I want to ask you about mouth taping. What's up with that? What is it?
Let me also refer you to James Nestor's book called Breath, that has all sorts of really interesting things about breathing. It's not primarily about sleep, but it talks a lot about mouth taping. In the background, there are all these important things that are happening to human faces. And that's one of the things that he talks about in the book Breath. When I first saw this on a podcast, I was like, what? Evolutionarily, our face is wrong? I'm like, come on, that's crazy. He does a very nice review of it. Stephen Park does a lot of review of it. Now, in the background, it turns out that if you breathe through your mouth instead of your nose, your biology basically changes. And that there were many, many movements within Native Americans and other more primitive societies, including Indian healing, so Eastern health societies, that knew that breathing through your nose was the normal way, and breathing through your mouth usually brought bad health. And he goes through this whole review of that. In the meantime, there are a lot of things that have coalesced together to lead to mouth breathing being very common now. The last 2 or 3 generations commonly breathe through their mouth at night because their nose is stuffed up. There are a concomitant number of things causing the nose to be stopped up, but they are all in the background somehow related to vitamin D. Vitamin D directly, vitamin D affecting the microbiome affecting our allergies. So ultimately, it's common that you can't breathe through your nose, and therefore in sleep, the formation of the top and bottom of your face, the middle portion of the face, the top upper jaw and the lower jaw, are actually formed with the mouth closed, or they're supposed to be. With the mouth closed, the tongue is constantly telling the brain where everything is. So that the actual growth of the upper jaw and the lower jaw is not advancing correctly, so that kids have retrognathic and less in the middle face. There's a whole set of articles about this in the late 1800s by a guy named George Catlin, who James Nestor also has a whole section about, that says he went among the Native Americans and did a bunch of pictures of them, line drawings and paintings, to show that the formation of their face led to these beautiful big arches where none of the teeth were crooked and they didn't have dental caries. So he wasn't even a dentist at the time. He also had lived in Great Britain, and he was comparing the habits of the British at the time, which were to have their baby sleep on a pillow so their neck was extended and their mouth was open. And he had these really gross pictures of what the British dentition looked like at the same time, okay? There's another guy called Weston Price, who's a very famous dentist who in the 1930s began to do photographs and videos of native populations. And he actually went to New Zealand and had a lot of pictures and videos of Maoris and compared that to Hawaiians and other Inuits, and showed that what he thought was the food of commerce, that they moved to canned foods, which was playing a role. But as soon as the white people came into these areas, they also brought the missionaries, in my belief system. In come the missionaries, and they shame them about their nakedness, and they tell them they have to put on clothes. So there's a concomitant thing, which is you see these Hawaiian women in black dresses up to their necks swimming in the ocean. I'm like, what? So in the background, there is now a movement to say, if you just tape the mouth closed, and it doesn't have to be a full taping, it just be a little piece of tape across the mouth. It just reminds your mouth to stay closed during the night. Now, there's a lot of scary parts about that because, you know, if you do that to your 3-year-old, then you're kind of worried they're going to stop breathing in the middle of the night. So there are a whole podcasts about how to do this in a much more gentle way, plus learning about the things that lead to nasal congestion, and also that a lot of people who tape their mouth find within about 2 or 3 minutes their nose clears up, which is weird. But there's this whole nervous system that's dedicated to knowing whether or not you're breathing or not, and it actually opens up some of the nasal sinuses. I am not the expert in this area. I would really recommend you to James Nestor's book about it.
My sister is reading that at the moment. She thought, she commentaries that it's a great book. Mouth taping, CPAP machines. It's something that you've talked about, and I preface this by saying a friend of mine was given one recently, and he couldn't get comfy using it, so I gave it back. And after listening to what you've had to say about these things, it's almost like you could take your D and take your Bs, but is it like a kickstart to get you sleeping again? And if so, should I be ordering a CPAP machine off Alibaba? Yeah, talk to me about CPAP.
Okay, so what happened to me was one of my clients asked me for a sleep study. She's a young, healthy female, no fat neck, nothing. She doesn't look the way she should. And she has bad sleep apnea, and she puts on a CPAP machine and all her headaches go away. And to me, that was complete reverse logic. One, I mean, her head hurts terribly, and she's strapping this device on her head at night. Like, how can that possibly have any placebo effect? I just couldn't imagine that it could. I couldn't imagine even convincing somebody to do that. Yet her headache goes away. So for 5 years, I've got CPAP devices and sleeping pills, and that's it. And they're better than nothing, but they're very, very unsatisfying. The CPAP effect wears off. By the 4th year, people are coming back and saying, I felt so good in the first year on this, and now I feel tired again. I wear it every night. There's another piece, which is I had a very good pulmonologist. When he left, many of my clients would be seen by someone and they'd say, well, you either wear it or you die. That was it. If we're going to suggest that you're dying and you know that you're dying, and this is the way of getting you not to die and have agonizing pain and all these medical problems, it seems to me like we should be responsible for getting it to work. So number one, no one's going to be able to wear that thing when they're awake. I mean, why would you? It's totally uncomfortable. That means I have to be responsible for having that person get to sleep. The CPAP doesn't put you into sleep. It's not this comfy little place. It's this weird apparatus. So my pulmonologist, Chuck Perkins, who was helping me initially, was really good with the sleeping pills. And he would get these guys sleeping, and they'd come back and go, I didn't want to go there because I get up every hour to pee, and there was no way I'm going to wear that stupid thing. And he puts them on a sleeping pill. Doesn't matter which one. If he's not successful the first 2, he's willing. He had this concept that it's only helpful if they are asleep. And they come back and say, I'm sleeping 8 hours and I don't get up to pee. Explain that to me. And I was like, I can't explain that. And that is a fascinating thing. Like, what's going on there? Does that imply that getting into deep sleep means you don't make as much urine? Well, yeah, that's kind of what it means. And that puts the sleeping pills in a totally different place, okay? So in the meantime, I've got the guys like your friend who can't tolerate CPAP. I've got the people on CPAP. I'm worried about giving the ones that can't tolerate CPAP a sleeping pill because I'm afraid they're going to die in the middle of the night. I got to blame me. I've got all these things that I don't understand. And then I stumble into this possible deficiency state. And I start giving it to everybody. And the thing that's fascinating is the people who are wearing CPAP, who are well adapted to it, they get better like that. Like the two guys that were able to see a D effect were both happily on CPAP for a whole year. That was helping them. That means they could see an incremental change. That also means there's a physiologic chemical basis at the same time that there's a physical basis, and that both of those have to be addressed to be successful in some people. So then I was just doing this vitamin stuff on top of everything else I was doing. And that means I got to see, okay, these people get better faster. And then I'm starting to feel like, oh, it looks to me like the people who've had sleep disorder for 35 years, they're going to get better slower. Like they have more repairs to make. And then I start making up stories to try to convince people to hang in there, not to give up. But it's not that CPAP is the only place to start. The way I would look at it instead is whenever they do a sleep study and they say, oh, you have terrible sleep apnea, then they should offer you whatever options are available. But they should also be willing to say, I will help you sleep with this on, and not be afraid of the sleeping pills. And if you can't tolerate your CPAP mask, then you go towards an oral appliance with a sleep dentist. And in my country anyway, the sleep dentists have a whole different industry where they really examine the anatomy in a way that doctors are not taught about. And then you can do my stuff in parallel with any of those. I really think every single person who's fatigued and doesn't sleep well needs to have the physiologic brain basis and the anatomic evaluation at the same time. It'll be another 10 years before we get there for everyone. But that's what you're introducing, is those concepts.
I tell you, one of the worst sounds in the world is listening to someone grind when they're asleep. So, you mentioned sleep dentistry, and man, it's a really, really hard thing to listen to. But it kind of implicated in bruxism, and it also connects to the trigeminal pathway, which for me is very interesting as it opens up a discussion around cluster and migraine headache pain. So just I guess start by talking about bruxism and then dovetail into this. I know I pronounced it wrong, but you can correct me.
What, bruxism? You said it right.
The bruxism and this pontine reticulus claudalis nucleus.
Oh, I lost you for a little bit there, so I didn't hear that. I have to say that I don't feel like I'm an expert in bruxism, as I make up my own idea about what bruxism is about. So bruxism is grinding the teeth, as you described. I saw that as just not getting paralyzed correctly. And then I sat for 5 or 6 years, the last few years, in sleep dentistry lectures, and they taught me so much about the anatomy of the head and the mouth and the neurology of those. And I would go back and read about, wow, we touch the back of our palate and that's automatically turns up the parasympathetic system. And when we bring the jaw out forward, it turns up the sympathetic system. Could it be that those areas could be used by the nervous system to adjust the talking of the autonomic two halves during sleep? You wouldn't think that they would need to do that, but there's no reason why you couldn't say, okay, we're just going to make the tongue touch the top of the roof of the mouth, and we're going to change the parasympathetic tone, or we're going to put the jaw out a little bit. And that means the dentist's viewpoint of this was, there's apnea because of a physical obstruction, and that turns the sympathetic tone up, and then that makes me do stuff with my jaw. That's there, and it's a stress response. And I now kind of think it could be either both and wrapped together. So I think what I have seen is when the D goes low, you can get bruxism. When your D goes high, you can get bruxism. There's no change in anatomy there. And when I got my D too high the first time, started waking myself up, snorting. And I hadn't been doing that. So I know that the several things that intervene and become acetylcholine. So there are 2 or 3 players together, but D is one of them. The acetylcholine level during the night can induce bruxism or apnea in someone who never had it before, or at least had it in a much more mild form. So at the moment, I would class that as you're not getting paralyzed correctly. But that's just my opinion. The sleep dentists see a little different.
Yeah, sure. And I guess to talk about sleep temperature, it's like the age-old. I want to kick the blankets off. My wife wants to be really warm. That's really interesting. Have you got any commentary you could offer in and around that?
Yes, and I'm also not an expert in this, but one of the things that happens during sleep, and I am imagining it happens because the hypothalamus has to repair itself. So if you imagine the nighttime is when we repair things, and the hypothalamus is the central area for all control of temperature, heart rate, all that sort of stuff. Well, the hypothalamus never gets to repair itself. It always has to be functioning. So we're talking about paralyzing the limbs, taking them out and then repairing them, but you can't just say, okay, let's just stop the heart and, repair the hypothalamus. So I'm imagining that what the hypothalamus does is runs everything, and then it kind of turns off for about a half an hour. And our temperature actually goes, we become poikilothermic, we adjust to whatever the ambient temperature is. So that we actually have these rises and falls in temperature where the hypothalamus kicks in again and goes, oh, the covers, oh my God, I'm way too hot. And so it's a matter of saying my temperature sensor and my temperature adjuster goes off for a half an hour. So I get really hot, I kick off the covers, and then the hypothalamus turns off. And then I'm really cold now. And then you're like, what? I have to put the blankets on again. That's a really wimpy answer. But now the real answer is, one, you used to be able to do that and stay asleep. And those of us who are not sleeping well wake up all the time having to do that. So the normal state was you were in light sleep, you put the covers on, you were in light sleep, you took the covers off, but you never woke to consciousness.
And we start talking about cycles it makes me think immediately of cluster headache, because it's so cyclical in nature and always comes on at those, well, not always, but for the most part comes on in those hours when you'd expect to be sleeping. Now it comes to a point where I guess I want to ask you about dosing and supplementation and some of the common questions that I get asked now. I guess the long and the short of taking enough D to get to 80 nanograms per milliliter varies so significantly across people. Just in my personal experience, I take 600,000 international units from baseline of the standard New Zealander at 24 nanograms per milliliter. I shoot up fairly quickly to around 80 to 100 nanograms per milliliter. Before the interview, I told you about an acquaintance of mine over the period of 45 days has consumed 1,500,000. You're hearing that right, ladies and gentlemen, 1,560,000 international units, and his level is now at 51 nanograms per milliliter. This may speak to whether people see results or not and get disheartened or not. So I'd really like to understand your lens and experience on this.
Let me just preface this before. You had mentioned cluster headache, and that's what got you here. Doesn't it seem like you think that cluster headache, because it comes on a specific time in the night and comes in a seasonal, repeating every year sort of way, that somebody would have clued into the fact that this was a sleep disorder. Like, duh. It's like one of the things that when I was into this a ways, I was like, oh my God, I haven't seen a cluster patient in a while, but this has been telling us all along that this is a state in the brain stem, or at least related to the trigeminal nucleus, probably in the brain stem. So anyway, I'm just blown away that we in medicine are so dense. Now, your next question is about de-dosing. So I have to tell you that what happened to me, I would never do again, because at the time I was so naive, I had no idea just how scary it would be. In retrospect, I really find vitamin D being a pretty scary thing. We're basically taking a hormone that we know very little about, and we're dosing it like a vitamin, which is really wrong. So one, I started with 1,000 IUs like everybody told us to do, and then nothing really happened. And the levels didn't go up. And then we went to 2,000, and then we went to 5,000. So the guy that you just mentioned who was taking 30,000, I did have a few people who over a period of many months, because we were up at the maximum of what I was willing to give, which was 20,000, that I got up to 30,000. I had a few patients that stayed on 30,000 for 2 or 3 years to keep their levels stable. Okay, so I want to give you a bigger picture of that. Then if you follow them for 5 years, what you'll find is by the 3rd year, usually they come in and there's a D level that's way too high. And you're like, well, what did you change? Like they've been taking 30,000 a day for 2 solid years, unlike your guy who took it for 45 days. And now their level has shot up and we go down to 20,000, and then it's still too high and we come down to 15. And over a period of years, they come back down into the same range as everybody else needs. Now, does that mean they're not absorbing it? Of course not. This is one of the pivotal central chemicals that came with flowering plants. It's not going to be not absorbed. That's ridiculous. Also, the people who are writing these articles are not following patients clinically, because we're not really taught how to do it. It's hard, and then nobody wants to listen to our clinical experience. So in the background, because we don't really know much about this chemical, and because we have really scary things happen with other hormones, like testosterone. Well, gee, testosterone is cheap as dirt. You can get a compounding pharmacist to make up a little cream for you. It costs $15 for 3 months. But the drug company wants to be able to figure out a way to get some money from it. So they make an injectable that's once a month, that's slowly released for the whole month in the same way. And then those men come in and say, I'm growing breasts. I'm getting all these weird things happening to me. And you find out that testosterone, when given in a huge dose, becomes estrogen. That every single one of these hormones has an array, a rainbow of states that they get into. It gets broken down. That means you better pay attention to what can happen actually in nature, because you don't know what's going to happen to you in 4 or 5 years, because we don't know jack. So I would have to say that, one, I would only recommend that anybody doing this ever goes to 20,000 as a maximum, and you better be testing your levels monthly. And the reason for that is that that's the most that we've ever been able to document that somebody makes in a day. That's a very difficult undertaking, okay, to measure how much they make. Now, the second piece is there are a set of articles back in the 60s that were done in lifeguards where they just did D levels over time with people sitting out in the sun for long, long spans of time, and they couldn't run their levels above 80. That was not with oral supplementation, that was with sunlight, okay? So that means to me, there is a natural place where the D wants to be at the top end, okay? Now, in my experience, my patients usually start to sleep not as well when their D goes to 58, and not as well when their D goes to 78. So that 80 might be the maximum, but you really would like to see whether or not you feel better in the mid 60s or whether you feel better at 72. And there is a sweet spot for some people if they're paying attention and doing their Ds frequently enough that it doesn't get lost in the background. that they'll say, I do better at this particular level. And then let me tell you a few other things that I think are important. One, that does not mean that that's the ideal level for humans. That means that's the ideal. So the question that Walter and I posed was, if everybody's sleeping badly in my practice and they all have low D levels, is there a D level that might make them sleep better? That was the whole question. A D level of 60 to 80 has still maintained over the last 12 years as being a better place for someone who had a sleep disorder to sleep better. Now, does that mean that somebody who's never had a sleep disorder and has never been D deficient in their whole life, hunter-gatherers that are still living a normal life for humanoids, no clothes, don't even have a hut, their D levels are in the 40s and 50s? Could that mean that I actually have to push my D a little higher than that because there's such a big deficiency state in the background? Okay, and let me give you a different way to look at this blood level. What happens when we take the D in is that every single cell in your body that needs it says, Craig, yes, you're the dude, I'm taking this stuff. It sucks up every single molecule that gets in your body. And what you see in the blood level is the stuff that's left over. It doesn't have anything to do with what's in the brain, nothing to do with that. It really has nothing to do with, did each cell that needed it only get 1/8 of what it really is needed? So when you see somebody over a 5-year span go from needing 30,000 a day to stay the same blood level, their blood level is 65, and it's staying at 65, and they're using 30,000 a day. And then over a period of years, their need goes down. That suggests they were in a profound deficiency state. And by the way, those people are really sick. Like, this is a 32-year-old who's had one baby, who has a profound immunodeficiency disorder, and she is on 15 medicines and she's 32, and she has a million things wrong with her, okay? It's not just, hey, I thought I'd ask Stasha about sleeping better, okay? The really, really sick ones have probably had a profound deficiency since birth and are redheaded, really freckled, can't really be out in the sun. So there are many aspects to this that you're going to ask about genetics in a minute. I don't know if she has a genetic problem with the D receptor, but the thing that's been important to me in the background was, we don't even know how to give D to people that don't have a genetic problem. I just took every single person in my practice and I saw these clinical stories. What I found out really fast was, if you have a long clinical history, you're more likely to take more over a longer span of time. But then eventually you'll fall back down into this range where my daily use comes to a medium size, kind of like everybody else. Like the beginning part, we were 10,000 in the winter, 5,000 in the summer to stay the same. But that's not really the same as how much do I have to take to go from a level of 12 to a level of whatever, okay? There's another piece about these curves with the levels, and that is, it appears to me that levels below 20, they can be profoundly deficient and be on dialysis and be 42 years old and be really sick. And their level really never drops below about 18 or 15. So that the level is no longer linear there, okay? It's not reflective of what the cells are experiencing. The cells are sick and dying, and the level has not gone to zero. Same thing above, where the actual, if you follow what happens above 80, it tends to exponentially go up, as though the amount that's being absorbed by the cells, once the level goes up, it's staying in the blood, or that's the way it kind of acts to me. This is not very scientific, but so in the background, there's a really different experience. So you've been doing this for a few years. What you'll see if you start to follow people over 2 or 3 or 4 years over time is you get a different feel for how you want to do this. And the really thrilled, I'm sleeping better, lasts about 3 or 4 months until they go too high, and then it goes down the tubes again. And if you don't make the point, you have to come back and do your levels every month for a while. You'll just have 3 good months of sleep and then you'll feel awful.
So a question then in and around consistency of levels across the seasons. You know, should there be a natural fluctuation in levels? So, you know, hitting your summertime high and then troughing through the winter and coming back and forth. And so, what is the consideration around? I think Judson Somerville put it quite nicely in his book when he talks about winter syndrome. And so I guess the question to you, Stasha, is, well, what's the consideration around a body being in an endless summer time, kind of summer syndrome? Is this something that should be considered?
Craig, you are so smart. These are really, really, really good questions. So the first question is, do the D levels fluctuate? Well, if you're at the equator and you spend the same amount of time outside every single day, as your body gets to somewhere like 70, there are systems on the skin that prevent more D from being made. That means we, like every other hormone, even though this is made on the skin, the concept of hormones is there is a homeostatic set point that every single hormone wants to come back to this set point. Now, then you argue, okay, we move away from the equator. So if this hormone was there to help us adjust certain things, that means that there's a winter D state and a summer D state. The winter D state is we sleep more, we're slower, we're slow moving, we just sleep all the time, we get fat, and we don't do very much. Now, in the past, if you have 8 children and 3 wives and you're in your little teepee and there's 8 feet of snow outside because you're living in Canada, there was a huge survival advantage to that because you had 1 piece of dried meat a week to feed those kids, and they better shut up or we're all going to kill each other. So you picture that happening in humans because we couldn't really migrate to the equator, and there's a big advantage to that. Now, if you take that instead to a population that is profoundly D deficient and therefore really sick, and they're interested in this because they're really sick and they want to fix themselves, that's kind of a different thing, okay? What I'm really trying to teach people is how we can biohack to stay in a summer mode where we are performing at our peak. But that's still 60 to 80. That's not more is better. It's really, how does my body tell me I'm at my peak? And then what is my sleep saying? And that we're constantly focusing on the sleep, constantly trying to heal our body better by doing that. And then you find a set of parameters that you follow over time to make sure that your sleep and your healing is the best. Is it pain when I wake up? Is my body moving? So in the background, yes, the natural state was for the D to go up and down. Okay. Now, I want to give you one other parenthetical thing right there. The dosing of D is being said to act like a fat-soluble vitamin. It's never been a vitamin. It's not a fat-soluble vitamin. We do not make it and store it. Like if I can tell you the D is made in the summer, and then this different state of hibernation happens in the winter, if we stored it in our fat and released it in the winter, there would never be a winter state. There would never be an ability to sleep more, have my babies under the ground, and have my fertility linked to when I mate as a bear in the fall so that I can have my babies underneath the ground where they're protected, where there's snow. And I don't eat for 4 months. I'm feeding my babies, but I don't eat. That's amazing. Now, if you look at it through that evolutionary lens, and this was never stored in our fat. There's this huge amount of totally inaccurate legend that means I can give you 100,000 today because we store it in our fat and we, put it out over the week. That's never the way it is actually done physiologically in the body. That means it's dangerous to do that. Very, very intelligent researchers who are not on the clinical side, who have not been thinking about the fact, but this never is found in nature. Especially 100,000 IUs of D2, that's never found. That's never been available. So
we'll talk about D2 and different forms of vitamin D. But just sticking with this conversation, and it was about 3 weeks ago that I found out. You can laugh that the appendix actually has a job. I thought it was just this organ that was kind of being phased out in humans. So.
Yes, isn't that weird that we're taught that the appendix is useless? No, it's not. It's a really intelligent little organ.
I'm almost 40 years of age, Dr. Gominak, and as I say, 3 weeks ago was the first I'd heard, and it just got me thinking. Like if it's a bug store, then is it not possible that in and around the fluctuation of vitamin D levels throughout the season that's the appendix's role in order to reintroduce the bacteria as the serum level increases and is able to support that particular kind of bacteria?
That's a brilliant idea. Let me tell you what happened to me. I finally get into B50. I'm doing D for 2 years. I do the B50. I get my microbiome back. And then about a year later, I get appendicitis. I'm 63. Like, appendicitis is not a disease of 63-year-olds, okay? And I have no other medical problems. So I have to picture that. And that's the first time I go online. Where do I go? What? They take my appendix, and then I go online and it says, the appendix is at a 90-degree angle because when you poop out all of your poop because you had a bad Mexican food or whatever, it's 90 degrees. Therefore, the bugs stay in there. They're your colony. They're your library. Well, it seems to me that the timing of that suggests that my entire GI tract and my skin and everything else has been recolonized by these new 4 happy, healthy guys. And about a year later, they go in and they try to fight it out with the bad guys who are still way down there in the appendix. And they're having this battle about who's going to be dominant here. And nowadays, they say you should just treat it with antibiotics and not take the appendix. Of course, they took mine because I didn't, know enough to, and like that morning when they were deciding about it. So it's possible that the microbiome does all sorts of things with D that I don't understand, okay? But I don't think it's a logical thing to say that we store it. That would take out the entire concept. So again, if you start into it with Walter's lens, which is a fascinating thing, this is really about starting to realize that we look at things in science through a belief system. That is not what we're taught. We're taught that it's the truth. And then you live 30 or 40 or 50 years and you realize that the truth has changed dramatically in the time you've been alive, okay? If you step into this through the evolutionary eye of someone who looks at fish, insects make the same D that we do. They sleep the same way. And cicadas can go into the ground and sleep there for 15 years. And they have these very specific bugs that have to live in their intestine for them to have this specific cofactor for them to do that. If you look at it through that lens, then the idea that we save this D, no, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense. Now, does that mean it moves really fast? No, it really still needs to be tested once a month, okay? Hormones move slowly up and down. But to me, that suggests that you should really never be dosing this once a week. That has a different effect than once a day. Because I stepped into it from the sleep standpoint, what I rapidly saw was my patients who were B12 deficient, who were giving B12 shots once a month, came back and said, I get 2 good nights and 28 bad ones, and I'm giving my shot once a week. Well, right off the bat, if it's my sleep, I'd like to have every single thing my brain wants to sleep well every night. I don't want to give it too much on one night and then not enough 5 out of the 6 days that are left. That doesn't make any sense. So then looking at the way we dosed D, there's this really confusing history as D being called a vitamin. It's screwed everything up. And all these weird little paths have been followed even till today because we have not decided to treat it like a hormone because we understand hormones. We just have completely ignored that part.
I mean, if someone over 65 goes to see their family practitioner in New Zealand, that practitioner will write a script for D3, thankfully, at 50,000 IU without a test to be taken monthly, and so it kind of speaks to the point of kind of just not seeing the bigger picture in and around dosing strategy and talking about dosing strategy. Look, one could be forgiven for ending up very confused in and around target levels. Now there's some real synergy, as I said earlier, in and around that 80 sweet spot for my cluster headache stopping and what you're talking about. But I interviewed Henry Lahore of the Vitamin D Wiki, and I almost broke my bloody microphone when he mentioned he keeps his level around 200 nanograms per milliliter, and there are other researchers and people postulating that they're taking those high levels as well. Just some views and thoughts in and around that really high dosing.
Okay, so there's a really different outcome of D by itself with a microbiome that is not making B5. So this goes back to the original lecture. You have to understand that there's a connection here. People who have not converted their microbiome they're increasing their choline acetyltransferase. So we know the enzyme that's made by D in the brainstem. And they're increasing that choline acetyltransferase, but if they don't have either choline or coenzyme A, then the amount of acetylcholine that their nervous system is experiencing is nowhere near as high as my patients, okay? So there are people who are running their levels into the 200 range and saying that they have no physical complaints from it. My first question would be, how's their microbiome? Two, if they bring back their microbiome, my own experience has been that they will have a completely different chemistry. So it's not uncommon this is a slightly different question, but it's not uncommon for me now to see people who've been with a naturopath for a couple of years. Their D has been in the 60s for like the last 5 years. They're on B100 and they still have terrible sleep. They wake up 4 times a night. And I'll say, okay, this is not going to make any sense to you because you probably don't remember this, but you got better in the first few years when you were doing this. But now you came back with the same exact thing you had before. And it's related to the fact that you're on way too much Bs now. You have to stop that B100 and your sleep interruption will stop. And it usually goes completely away. Now, does that say the whole thing is all finished? No, because they just took away their sleep for the last 4 years. So they had their own microbiome making the natural amount of Bs. So the general concept in the background is our body was completely intact, self-formed, self-assembling and self-repairing every night using the amount of B vitamins that are made by the belly bacteria. When we lose those, then we operate on a low B state for a long time. And then when we bring them, so that means I can run the D up into higher levels and not get anything wrong. I'm not sure that these people who say they have a level of 200 and have nothing wrong with them, no bad effect, I don't think they're really paying attention because the great majority of my patients had bad things wrong with them, but they didn't know that they were related to D. Okay, so we'll do that at the end. But when you bring back the Bs, you now have all the components to make acetylcholine, and the nervous system of most people don't tolerate a big difference in the amount of acetylcholine that's made. For instance, in everybody who has cluster headache, they aren't just low D. They don't have a normal microbiome. Nobody really gets sick just because the D goes low, because it was supposed to go up and down. So you running them to 80 is not a bad idea. They get to 80, but when and if they convert their microbiome by bringing the bugs back with the B50 plus the D, they're going to find that the amount where they want their level to be may actually be a little bit lower to get their sleep better. They may never get cluster again because just getting the D up usually makes your sleep better enough that you won't get cluster again. But you may not be exactly where you'd like to be in terms of perfect sleep. My view of cluster is it's an end stage. It's really, your body should have never done that to you. That doesn't mean that you're going to just easily get back to completely normal and happy and perfect the way you'd like to be. And I still would be open-minded about saying, I really think everybody should do what feels best to their own body. The other comment I would, go ahead.
Well, yeah, and so I understand in and around, some folks will already have a browser window open, Stasha, looking at pantothenic acid, and they'll see one of the definitions, of course, is panto, Latin for everywhere. And so, give it to me straight. Is there no pantothenic acid left in the produce I'm buying in the supermarket? Is it really that much different than a trip to Nana's house on the weekend where she ripped that turnip and a couple of carrots and a head of broccoli out of her back garden, kind of washed them under the hose, and I got them with a bit of gravy. Is there really that much of a difference?
Your questions are fabulous, Craig. I would never have gone down this path had not my patients gotten really angry with me. So what I ended up, saying is related to now thousands of people having a profound physical experience to taking pantothenic acid. Okay, so one, but everything says is there is no pantothenic acid deficiency because it's in every food. And likely the first part of the sentence, there is no pantothenic acid deficiency, was pretty close to being right in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, when people were still rural and they hadn't lost their microbiome. So the first half is okay. But the fact that it's in every food, that's just not true. There are no articles that show that pantothenic acid is in that form in the food. It is in coenzyme A because it's rapidly made into coenzyme A, and that's the way it is in the food. And the assumption was made that when you ate coenzyme A, it was broken down into its component parts and B12 was then absorbed. That's never been shown. And when my patients have Ds in the 60s, and I give them 400 milligrams of pantothenic acid, the way it's sitting innocently on the shelf, and they come back and yell at me, 30 out of 40 of them come back and say, this stuff here, this nearly killed me. What were you trying to do? It's the recommended dose. They all said the same thing. I got so revved up, I got nervous, anxious, and I couldn't sleep at all. I stopped it after 2 days. Now, how can that be in any food? It's not. So when you go back into the science and say, who was it and how was it that they documented that it's in the food? It was a bunch of assumptions, and it was probably correct assumptions within the setting of this literature is coming out before the 1980s when everybody starts to lose their microbiome. So instead, if you look at it as before 1985, this is not completely true, but the great majority of people in their younger, healthy years still have a normal microbiome because that's what every animal on the planet has. And then after the 1980s, we start to see epidemics of multiple linked things: fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, sleep apnea, fatty liver, increase in diabetes, increase in autism, increase in ADHD. If you look at all of those things, they all share various aspects of having to do with acetylcholine and sleep. So it's very challenging to our previous thoughts, but there is no scientific literature that shows that there's pantothenic acid in food. And in the person who, like, say, you have cluster, you get your D to 80, and you still have a microbiome that isn't right, you could actually take 400 milligrams. I have some people who are on 400 milligrams. Like when I started with that group of 40 people and 30 of them yelled at me, there were 2 gals that had burning in their hands and feet. Okay, one of the very few things that was documented in the articles in the 1950s where they made people artificially B5 deficient with a blocker. They got 4 things: can't sleep, funny gait, belly hurts, and burning in the hands and feet. So the 2 gals that had that, both of them got better within 2 days. One of them had to stay on 400 milligrams for another 3 years until I left practice. So there are occasional genetic things that mean that I may need 400 milligrams when the next person needs 40. And that's the case for many of these things. But ultimately, in terms of the normal population, our biology came second to what the bugs make. That means the original way it was put together is for us to need exactly the amount that the bugs make of these 8 chemicals.
Fascinating stuff. Talk to me, and I don't know if it's a coincidence, but I can't tell you how many, maybe a friend has said, oh, my wife had a parathyroid removed. My mum's-in-law, is on thyroxine. Why so many women, it seems, in their kind of 50s, 60s start having issues with these glands? And is it a consideration for those folks before thinking about supplementing vitamin D? Is it something that they should or should not be doing?
Okay, great questions. So as I'm sitting here in my office and I'm reading about vitamin D, And I'm thinking, it's funny, over the 30 years I'm practicing, I've just gotten to be used to the fact that this 32-year-old with headache has a couple of other things. She's on an antidepressant, she's on a reflux medicine, and she's on a thyroid medicine. Well, why would she be on those? Okay, what I'm trained in medicine is look for the symptoms, here's the drug, here's the disease, okay? I'm never trained to say, well, she doesn't want to be sick. Why would she be sick at all? Why would her thyroid stop working? Why 5 years from now she has another family practitioner and that family practitioner says, well, you don't need to be on thyroid. Well, why did she need to be on it before and she doesn't need to be on it now? Okay. When you think back to that bear hibernating in the ground and we say their metabolic rate goes down, that means what we have is a hormone that affects the metabolic rate of all the cells in the body. What is it that does that? The thyroid does. So there are D receptors in the pituitary that has the thyroid releasing hormone. So some of Walter's very first articles were about the fact that the pituitary is covered with vitamin D receptors. That means it's a main controller to the sex hormones, to the adrenal hormones, to the thyroid hormone. That means if you happen to go in every spring for your annual in April, when your D is low, your thyroid might be low. Now, why aren't the endocrinologists putting that together? It's been there since the early 80s. So then later they come in September when she just went to the Bahamas and now her thyroid function is all wacky because she's on extra because her D is up and her thyroid function is up. So number one, D is linked in so many different ways. The second one that you see all the time in young healthy women is thyroid nodules. So all the omas, oma means normal cells that are recreating themselves, all right? In my view, D is a primary player in every single part of our body to be pro-repair. But when you think about what repair means, it means we're de-repressing, we're opening up this window of possibility of repairing things. But once you tell the cell it's okay to grow and repair, if we let it go just a step further, it can make two of itself. It makes two thyroid cells. Every single cell has the potential to make two of itself. How do we keep all these organs from doing that and taking over our body? Okay, we don't want to be filled full of liver. Okay, that's kind of what cancer is. There is a system that happens while we're sleeping that lets the cell open just enough to make repair, and then it goes, woohoo, he almost got a little crazy there and went on a rogue and made two of themselves. Okay. These omas, meningioma, adenoma, pituitary adenoma, lipoma, all of those are normal cells. They're not cancerous. They're not trying to do weird stuff. They're just fat cells. They're just thyroid cells. But the normal control center has not been active. That means their sleep is not good and the chemical makeup of that control is not good. Then that means we've now covered hypothyroidism and how it's connected to D, thyroid nodules and how it's connected to D. And then the third step is D is all about immunity. It has multiple ways that it affects the immune system. And then when the D runs the microbiome is a huge piece of immunity. So our body was never, ever designed to attack itself. Autoimmunity just wasn't ever supposed to happen. That means the autoimmunity side, or Hashimoto's thyroiditis of thyroid disease, is about the next step, which is the D is low, the microbiome is lost, and now you have an autoimmune state. The reason why it's frequently women and why classically the autoimmune diseases have been more common in women is they have the babies. They have the babies and the babies suck up their D, and then they have all these, they get fat and they get really unhappy and they get divorced because they're just not the way they used to be.
Yeah, it makes me think of a comment I've got pinned for our section on cluster headache, and that is, I'll mention it now. I cannot tell you the amount of times I'll notice a new mum come on our cluster headache discussion group or support group and say, just had a baby, clusters are back. And it's just like, for me, it's like, baby just took all your D, babe. It's like
Yes.
your D's low. But of course, it's, you know, you have to be tactful in how you approach these things and communicate the information. But just, you know, just seems like a no-brainer once the veil
And
is
Craig,
lifted.
we should mention fixing diseases that have happened through complex biological patterns is very hard, but preventing them from happening by having moms have D levels that support them and the baby so that these never happen is not that hard.
Mm, mm, Well, it's certainly going to require some changes on legislation down here. Genetic polymorphisms, man, it freaks people out when they hear that terminology and they're watching these sorts of videos. Polymorphisms in the genes or the enzymes that convert vitamin D through its various kind of metabolic states. How important is it for a person at home watching this, wanting to take D, maybe follow Sleep Right, to get a test to see if they have any polymorphisms? How common are they?
I truthfully do not know, Craig. I'm baffled by this all the time. I am absolutely fascinated by the chemistry of the vitamin D receptor, biochemistry in general. But to be truthful, I don't think we have any good idea about how to treat people who don't have polymorphisms. Therefore, we don't have a normal, okay? What I would say to each one of those people is, do your levels. The level is still the key. I also say in the workbook, in the Right Sleep workbook, that there's about 2 people out of 100 that need little tiny doses. Like we talked about the guy who needed 30,000. There are some people who stay between 500 IUs and 2,000. And they have a jump in their level that looks like somebody who's moving between 5,000 and 20,000. So there's something different about that person. Either if that stays constant, which it usually does, then it kind of implies that they make less on their skin, or that so it doesn't imply that the receptor is necessarily different, because I just gave them 1/10 of what everybody else would want, and the receptor is seeing it differently, okay? So that is a clinical observation that, in my view, has yet to be explained to me. It might be in there in the literature, but I haven't found it. And I don't think that the vitamin D receptors at the moment, except if you have profound bone disease or in other situations where you have someone who is a researcher who has actually connected your profound physical illness to this vitamin D receptor. And the rest of the people, you just follow the same thing and you try to connect, how does my sleep look compared to my level? And even knowing nothing about single nucleotide polymorphisms, the great majority of people, 80% of people, get their sleep better using D and B50 in my regimen. That means there are going to be some, genetic variations there. So I really don't have a good answer for that. I really feel like that's something that should come second once we have a decent sense for the normals.
Yeah. And so, look, if someone took, I guess, just sticking with the apprehension that folks may have, because as I said earlier, it's going to be a high chance that they don't have the support of their family doctor, but will proceed anyway. How long before you know that D is not for you and you should not be taking it?
Good question. One, always be conservative. Okay, look at whatever everybody else is doing and be conservative, and then see what your own body says. And then get some levels done. Get a level before you start. Get a level again in 1 month. You can always look at what your detail is. Okay, if my level was 21 and I took 10,000 for 1 month, and now my level is 28, you have some data. It went up 7 points in a month on 10,000. Likely, if it's not going to be summer next month and you stay on 10,000, it's going to go up 8 points again. That means you should always use your data. That line of increasing or decreasing is unique to each individual. That means you really have to have your own data. This idea that anybody can recommend any dose that they just throw out, that's wrong. Every single person needs a different dose and they need to acquire their own data.
Well, they say dose makes the poison, doesn't it?
Yes, and more importantly, every single person is on a different place on the timeline of their deficiency state. If you've been taking 2000 of D for the last 5 years and you do your D level and it's 32, you are not the same chemically as the person who's never had a D level, never taken D, and their level is 32. That we have one piece of data that it's 32, that's it. But you can actually give them 10,000 and it can go to 42. And the next person you give them 2,000 and go to 42. This is a really good example. I've got one gal who's seeing me for daily headache. She's got 3 kids. She does all 3 kids' D levels. She gives them all 2,000 apiece. The first one, and it doesn't even have anything to do with age or weight. She gives them all 2,000. The first one goes from 24 and then tests them again in a month. First one goes from 24 to 34. The next one goes from 18 to 78. And the next one goes from 32 to 42. Every single one of those kids, same mom, same dad, has their own trajectory. You have to use that.
Understood. I tell you, I'm a massive fan of bacon and eggs with mushrooms. Would be my chosen side. And if you go into a supermarket here in New Zealand, I'll put it up on screen for the folks that want to see. You can buy some field mushrooms. There's a big orange label on the front of the Stasha that says vitamin D mushrooms. Should I be eating more mushrooms? Can you start to, well, you mentioned D2 prior, and it's not so much of a risk for the folks in New Zealand that their family doctor will write them a script for ergocalciferol. But I'd certainly like your commentary for the folks that are in countries where they may end up with a script for D2. Is it bad? Should they be concerned?
Okay, my experience with D2 was that in the first few months that I was doing this, I would have people come in. Most of them are like 28, 31, 18. And then I had a couple of people that had levels like 5 or 0. And I was like, damn, 1,000 I use isn't going to do anything here. I'm still in a completely novice state. I have no idea what I'm doing. So I write them that D2 prescription because I go, ooh, 10,000. And it's a prescription. It can't possibly be wrong, right? So those people who had the most profound D deficiencies had really dramatic worsening of their problems with D2 in huge doses. It, in other words, acts as an antagonist. It acts as an opposite. It made them have diarrhea, have terrible pain, and not able to sleep. And then about the 4th or 5th person who I'd done that to came in and said, that stuff made me worse. So I went to Walmart and I bought the D3 and now I'm doing really well. It's about 6 weeks out. Okay. Now, in the background, that means I've never used it again. I still have friends who have been given D2 who say things like, now that you point that out, I always have a headache on Sunday morning and I always take it on Saturday. That's really interesting. So problems are it's dosed once a week and we really don't know because no one's looked in a clinical setting of what it does to our patients. I don't think in your normal life you can get enough D2 from mushrooms to hurt you in any way. I've never seen one of my patients, and when we get those LCMS results back, it tells you the D3 and the D2. So I have a few people who just went and got like a huge crate of mushrooms, and they've been having mushrooms like a mushroom festival for the last 2 weeks. And their D2 is like 6, okay? It's not less than 4, which is and they don't usually report anything negative. So I think it's about in the center. It is something that we would eat. We just have to recognize that we would have eaten those mushrooms when we found them, but it has never been a nutrient. This is not a nutrient. That happens to be a nutrient, but we're not going to be able to dilute out. If we have a normal D level, it won't be enough to hurt us.
Talk to me about some other of the cofactors. If you post on a vitamin D group that you're taking kind of any significant amount of vitamin D, you must be taking your K2. It's almost the very first comment that you will see.
Yes, I don't know why they've gotten in that habit. Okay, so one, I don't care about your bones. You're responsible for your own bones. Okay, that's not my field. I'm very interested in your sleep. So when you're looking at D as though it is only about bone, which at this point I think is absurd, then you have to say, are there any other things that D is dependent on to get the calcium metabolism right? Okay. Now, let me give you a little bit of background. In the 1940s, when they just found ergocalciferol and cholecalciferol, and they're giving these chemicals to little German children, and they're making the chemical and then they're giving it to them, having absolutely no idea what the dose should be. There are all these horrific stories of them calcifying their eyeballs and terrible things like that. Okay. In those settings, K2 might have been important. Okay. Now let's move to the modern day and say, what does K2 really do? K2 takes the calcium that we have and it helps guide it towards the bone instead of calcifying things that are not supposed to be calcified. So in anyone that's doing extra D who has osteopenia or osteoporosis, or has parts of their body like the pineal or other tendons calcify when they're not supposed to be, one, that's a suggestion they've been D-low for a long time, but two, they might want to take a little K2. Now, my argument for not adding that to my list of things is, one, K2 is usually in your multivitamin. Two, the natural source for us was at least partially, perhaps in a major way, from our bacteria that also make K2. So it wasn't just a random amount of K2 from the food. We really did have a very specific set of things that were being given to us from our microbiome. So that's why I don't make a big deal out of the K2. It's not that it's not important. I just don't see any reason to add it. And don't add it to the D2 when I'm telling you, you have to adjust your D2 up and down so that you're taking 5 times the amount of K2 that you should be. And none of these things that are hormones, including K2, more is not better.
You know, I see my good female friends, they post they get into all sorts of stuff. Prebiotics, they get into, I saw one of them mention fecal transplants the other day. Look, to me, this just all seems a step too far. Is there value in, you know, post, what, you know, talking about all these sorts
Great
of other
question. Okay, I have to tell you that when I'm not in the GI literature, I'm a neurologist. So I get into this D stuff, and then it appears to me that I forced my people to be B vitamin deficient. And I'm reading these review articles about B vitamins, and those articles say thiamine has a colonic bacteria source and a food source, riboflavin, and they haven't gotten brave enough to say all the Bs really came from the poop bacteria. They are brave enough to state that. Yet, I got these guys up in Oklahoma who are doing these poop transplants. And that has come, you know, we've been telling each other about that for 5 years or so. And I'm like, doctors are the only people who would come up with a CPAP device and a poop transplant. I mean, I would have to be dying and desperate to do that. But you know what? They are dying. They are desperate. Yeah. So the logic behind it is, the poop is wrong. We're going to take a poop transplant. Like if I'm about to die, I'd go, sure, what the hell? Now, the first question would be, how did I get to this place? That is not normal. We just spent 100 years like, stay away from the poop, you know, clean your hands. So one, fecal transplant does work. And then the next question should be, if we just came up with that, don't you think there would be some way to maintain a better poop bacteria mix? Now, the first answer was, before the fecal transplant, probiotic, which means freeze-dried poop bacteria, and you just eat them, okay? Picture the fact that your bacteria, once they come to life, are a roiling mass like a river, okay? They hit your stomach. I don't agree with the idea that there are no bacteria in the small intestine. I think they have their own specific species throughout, and the small intestine is extremely hard to sample. That's why we don't have good answers about it. But so let's just say those bacteria are multiplying, but within a day they're pooped out. That means we really have to have the right environment, the right growth factors for them to replicate themselves and continue to make more of themselves, so that the water that I'm watching in that river that's now gone, there's still water there. Okay, so picture them as a moving river. So probiotics, if you do not have the growth factors that those species need, you'll just poop them out. They really didn't work. It's not like I don't care about them. I paid $60 a month for those things. We were trading probiotic recipes. It's not the right idea. The second idea, which is prebiotics, is a very smart idea, which is I'm telling you about the growth factors of B vitamins, but there are hundreds of other things that your bacteria like or don't like, okay? It just so happens that I stumbled into the vitamin realm before that was regular accepted news in the GI literature. I was not the first person to publish an article about it. It was one published right before mine that came about this idea that these 4 species actually coexist in nature because they trade these 8 vitamins. That was written just the year before. Now, having said that, those are only 8 out of hundreds of things that those bugs do for us. So there's another idea, which is these changes in our diet. Really what happens is we feed the bugs and the bugs feed us. You need to get the foursome back, the healthy foursome back, to get the kind of effect that people are telling you about for keto or paleo, for you to get the premier effect for humans. You really need to start with that foursome. But then once you have that, then you will notice that if you change your diet, different things will happen. And I think that my program is only as good as saying it's a foundation piece. It's not the answer to everything. If it turns out you have a choline deficiency or you have an iodine deficiency that's developed in the background, you're still going to have to investigate that. So I still think the prebiotics are a really smart thing. I think all the people who are talking about fermentation and eating fermented foods, there's some really interesting things about that because the B vitamins were really discovered in a fermenting solution. So I think they're really kind of sending back a mixture of B vitamins that really does help the bacteria to become healthier.
Look, kimchi has absolutely exploded in kind of that fusion Western cuisine.
Yeah.
You can even get it on your Eggs Benedict these days. So what the heck?
Get out of here. Kimchi on Eggs Benedict?
Sorry?
Whoa. Kimchi on Eggs Benedict, really?
Yeah, with prawns. It's not too bad. It wasn't too bad. It's at one of these hip places, far too hip for me. I can tell you that. I can tell you another place that's not so hip, but it certainly was a place I went to multiple times per week with my grandparents. It was Nana and Papa. And I tell you what, when you stayed over at their house, you were guaranteed a plate of offal. If it wasn't black pudding, it was lamb's fry. She cooked a good lamb's fry and bacon. My grandmother did. Vitamin A.
Wait,
Stasha.
what part of the lamb would it be?
A lamb's liver.
Oh.
Vitamin A. I just want to ask you. All this press, all this interest, all these studies on vitamin D. Yet I'm going to put some advertisements up on the screen from I think they were the 1930s or 40s for folks to check out at home. Vitamin A has received a lot of press. Are we missing something? Are all of our eggs in one basket when vitamin A is sitting there, the untouched, ugly cousin that deserves more interest?
Great question. Okay, so vitamin A is quite fascinating. The reason why I don't spend time talking about it is it's in your multivitamin. So there's this whole other path I want to go down with you that's really fascinating. Vitamin A is a corticosteroid. Steroids are what we call the hormones that are made from cholesterol. So cholesterol is this flat, so we know it's a fat, but also it's quite flat. It's got a ring structure. 5 rings. To make it a corticosteroid, we break one of those rings, and now the 2 parts become able to swing around each other. All of the steroid hormones that we make, which are all the sex hormones and all the adrenal hormones, are made from cholesterol. Vitamin A happens to be a vitamin. It does come from the outside. We don't make it, but it looks really similar to D. It looks just the same. It's called a corticosteroid. It has this ring structure that's broken. And vitamin A is probably the cofactor that sits with D and helps D have its own actions in all the sleep functions that it does in the head. Because we already know that retinoids play a role in the circadian cycle. So A is just as important as D. And the idea that I would have to then say, oh, vitamin A is really a vitamin and vitamin D is not really a vitamin is ridiculous, because they're both corticosteroids, they're both oil soluble, so is testosterone, okay? I would never say, this guy's obese, therefore I'm gonna give him a higher testosterone dose, because it goes into his fat and he stores it for later. If he stores it for later, why isn't he pulling it out of his fat so he can have a better heart on? Because that's not what happens. So we get into these little categories where medicine wants to say that's a this and that's a this and that. Biology doesn't care about that at all. So there's one really important thing. In the last 15 years, this guy named Slominski, and if you already know him, this guy is brilliant, looks at the vitamin Ds, come into the vitamin D through this unusual way, came into melanin through melanoma, so he's in the skin department. Then he gets into melatonin, which it turns out we make in our skin and we make all over our body. It's not just in the pineal gland. And then he gets into vitamin D. And he says, you know, vitamin D looks a lot like cholesterol. In fact, it's made from cholesterol on our skin. And there's this other, so what we're told right now, the legend is that there's this particular enzyme that takes vitamin D that you and I are measuring and makes the active vitamin D, okay? That's the only receptor anybody's looking at. And they think they know everything. He says, hey, what about this CYP11-1A? That is the enzyme that takes cholesterol to pregnenolone to make all of these sex hormones. I wonder if that enzyme would recognize vitamin D. So we asked the question, and yes, of course it does. And it turns out 1,25-OHD is only one of many. So this other hormone that's in the skin, it's not where we're making the cholesterol into pregnenolone, it's in the skin, it makes 17-20D. It makes 3,17-20D. And he's now done experiments showing that these other forms of D, he's not only shown what they do, that they hit the vitamin D receptor and they make certain proteins be expressed that in the skin are about not wrinkling, about repairing your skin. So there is a rainbow of active Ds that hit the vitamin D receptor, that's the recognized receptor. And these same forms hit another receptor called the aryl hydrocarbon receptor. Like aryl hydrocarbons are not something that is normally in biology. This receptor was called that because it was found to be a detoxifying receptor for these outside chemicals. But these types of D are quite active at this aryl hydrocarbon receptor that is all about inflammation. Now, what am I to do with that? One, it turns out that once the D we take in has the 25 attached to the liver, it looks like that CYP11-1A can no longer do its job on that. Once it becomes the 25-OH, it goes to this other pathway. Does that mean that perhaps biohacking with D3 is not exactly the same as being out in the sun? Yeah, that's what it means. Also, there are these fascinating articles about infrared light, all the other wavelengths and what they do, and that these infrared lights, these forms of sunlight that have nothing to do with UVB, are busily making melatonin, which is busily making our energy in our cells better. So the final summary, we don't know much. Biology has been here for billions of years. We should always look at this through the evolutionary window of, what did my grandparents look like? Okay, what was their lifestyle like? Like we have this long period of time between the 40s and the 80s where most childhood illness was actually combated. My husband's, relatives had 10 living kids, in bunk beds. They lived to adulthood. That means during the time that childhood illness, and they weren't starving to death, and they weren't killed off by big epidemics of cholera or something else, humans could actually live really pretty healthy lives. They had to be outside making their own food. It's not only the food. They actually canned everything. They boiled the shit out of everything. It's not like they had this raw food and they knew what they were doing. They were just trying not to starve to death of what they had. I think we should always look at these recommendations through the eyes of what do we know to be true in the actual generations that we saw. And then we reevaluate and say, well, maybe this is right, maybe this is wrong. I'm gonna try it myself with a specific parameter that I can measure and see what happens in my body.
So that's a real interesting topic when we start talking about epigenetics. It's a piece that is starting to be unraveled, in particular around inherited family trauma, and how all that works. And from a biblical context, I was always interested. There's some passages that kind of suggest the misgivings of one generation will be felt for 3 or 4 after. And so it does give you a lens into my genetics were based on my great grandfather and the way he lived his life, and the genes that he passed down through his lineage were undoubtedly preparing his offspring to live in a similar kind of environment. But of course, our environments have just so rapidly changed.
Point.
That it's like you've got babies being born in environments that it's like, hey, hold on, it's a mismatch here. I've got genes that are telling me I should expect to be doing this, but you're telling me to enter the metaverse. It's just like it leads into that philosophical piece and the message that Stasha Gominak is going to give to the likes of Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg through our final part of the discussion, which it looks like, Stasha, you're going to go skiing. Folks at home, she's taking off tomorrow and will be available later in the month of February. So it's my view we're going to continue and complete one more part of this discussion before letting her go and feed her husband and get ready, and that is to talk about testing and vitamin D. Now, as you know, I run a rapid assay test down here in New Zealand for folks to be able to get a lens into what their vitamin D level is doing. Now, folks in America, I have them reaching out via email literally daily saying, I found your site, can I order and get it shipped? And I'm like, I'm sorry, no. For folks in America, where can they get vitamin D tests? What would you recommend?
For folks in America getting vitamin D tests?
Yeah.
Ulta Wellness.
Right. And so I will make sure that we include a link for folks. Instead of emailing
that's on my website on the homepage, how to get that testing done.
No, it's just providing the service. But look, how often should people be testing? You've touched on that throughout this talk. Monthly, every second month. What's the go?
What I want for you is to be able to relate the physical feelings that are related to where your D level is. Okay, so you have 2 projects at the beginning. I want to get my D into the 60s. But I also want to be able to be paying attention. I want it to happen when the D gets over 60 and I can actually remember what was happening 2 months ago. Have there been any physical parameters that have changed once it crossed 60? Do I feel any different? And what are those things? Am I sleeping better? Do I wake up fewer times? Do my feet hurt less? Is my burning better? What about my bowel movements? So many of the things that we suffer from are really about the autonomic nervous system and acetylcholine levels. That's not the way we've been trained about them. So they're linked to D and the microbiome. Now, once you have these physical signs, then I want you to just take your D that you figured out is I'm going to stay the same dose for winter, which will be different than I'm going to stay the same in the 60s dose for summer, because you have a second source, which is the sun. Once you've figured out my stay the same dose, then you stay on that for 4 months. And then when those physical signs show up, then you go, uh-oh, something's off. And do I have to get my D level? So here's what I do. When my D goes low, I start to get visual aura of migraine, especially if I ignore the few little tiny baby headaches that really are not that important because I ignore them. And now it's down around 51 when I've had visual aura of migraine. And almost always I've been waking up at 3 a.m. and I can't go back to sleep. And I'm usually constipated. When my D is too high, I get weird pains in my body that are unique to each person, but I always wake up at 3 a.m. and I can't go back to sleep again. So, and I usually get constipated. Those are my things that are at both edges. Those are only cues that you're going to pick up if you're actually getting it monthly and writing stuff down and paying attention, because all the cues are the same things you've had before. If it were a purple horn growing out of your forehead that you've never had, and it's only been since you've been on D, then you go, this has got to be that D. Okay. So testing is what you need to be able to stay in the 60 range and always know that you're in that range and always be able to relate it. And the reason why we're doing that is not because D is perfect or 60s is perfect. What we want is to get anything that might keep your sleep better so that you're constantly watching your sleep, because the vitamins never cured anybody of anything except for your cluster headache, which it absolutely did. The vitamins are a step into how do I get my sleep to be great? That's where the healing really is.
Folks want to know what other tests should be considered. I ask specifically about checking calcium and parathyroid hormone at a level of around 60 or 80 nanograms per milliliter. Is that a consideration, or is it kind of only until you kind of start looking at these mega doses that maybe some other people are suggesting that you need to start worrying about that?
If you haven't had your calcium done by your primary, then you need to look at what your calcium is. You had mentioned earlier that some of the women have parathyroid adenomas. When you stop controlling, so the parathyroid controls the calcium level in the blood minute to minute. That's its job. So it's constantly saying how much calcium, and it's sucking it out of the bone. If you've been D low for years, the amount of calcium that you've taken in from your food, so D is two things regarding calcium. It induces it to be absorbed from the food, but it also keeps it from being dumped into the kidney. So it stops the calcium from being excreted. When you get your D better, there's more calcium. Now, the parathyroid that's been trying to do its job for years and years with too little calcium gets a little crazy, and it actually gets to the point of making a parathyroid adenoma. Then there's a set of cells that are no longer under the hormonal control. They're operating rogue, and they tend to make the calcium go very high. And you really have to take that adenoma out because it's no longer in the controlled network, okay? If the calcium is high, then they need to look for a parathyroid adenoma. That's the only situation where I've ever seen anybody run into trouble with that, with the exception of sarcoidosis. So also, people who got the message that they're supposed to take D and calcium together. The only people who ever run their calcium too high are the ones that are running their D now for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and they're still taking extra calcium. Osteoporosis is really not a calcium deficiency state. Once your D is okay, you can get all the calcium you need from the food. So if you have osteoporosis and your calcium is okay, then you can take extra calcium if you want, but if you run your calcium too high, then you have to stop the extra calcium. I have yet to see anybody who doesn't have those problems have any problems with hypercalcemia. It just doesn't happen. It's not the same as saying D is not going to get toxic. There's no toxic effect. It's not hypercalcemia. There are toxic effects because it will steal your sleep away when it goes over 80. And likely it will affect your gut bacteria because they have a little narrow band that they probably are supposed to have. And likely it's between 40 and 80 because that's where it usually runs. Then there's this very interesting question that one of my clients asked. Is it safe for me to think that that blood level that we're measuring reflects the intraluminal, the inside the gut level that the bugs are experiencing? Yeah. Absolutely it is. That means that the blood level is constantly going through the liver is constantly dumping it into the GI tract, and that is probably in an equilibrium. That means if I can show you articles that show that when you drop the D level to the microbiome in the mouse, and then there's one article by Francesca Guida that shows this. This is brilliant stuff. You drop the D level, you measure what the different species are in the microbiome of the mouse, And she did parallel studies to the excitability of the mouse spinal cord, pain perception, and showed that the species that make the building blocks for the endocannabinoids, which are major players in our nervous system for all the things that marijuana does, appetite, inflammation, sleep, that mouse's endocannabinoid system gets screwed up, and then their perception of pain, their perception of light moving touch becomes painful. And she shows that the chemicals they would have made in their nervous system are not being made anymore. What that implies to me is if you run your microbiome over 80, if you douse them with D, that's higher than, you've changed their foursome, you've changed their makeup, and you run the risk that you will do something that you aren't linking to that. But that state of over 80, that is not the natural state out there in the world before we had this in little pills.
That's we'll pick up some of those facets when we talk about something that's very dear to, I know my mother, God rest her soul, who ran a kindergarten for 25, 30 years, particularly interested in kids with autism and ADHD, and that what you just mentioned there will have gone over many people's heads, but they'll be very, very interested to kind of
very important for autism. Many of the features of autism, you can point at sleep, B vitamins, endocannabinoids. You add them all up, that's what you get. Autism.
My older sister has sold her kindergarten as of this year to go and study psychology this year, and I know that it will be that the conversation piece that we're having right there will be something of great interest to her. So there you go. Look, that completes the section on testing, which kind of would then lead into cluster headache and migraine and a lens over life in New Zealand and our disease burden. And we're going to pick that up in our next chat. I know people don't like to sit down for hours and hours and hours. And I know it will also be an opportunity while you're skiing and going down the slopes, people can add some comments to this video. If you've got any burning questions you would like me to pick up with Dr. Gominak, maybe early March, late February, do let me know and we'll do our best. But Stasha, it's great to connect with you. Some really interesting patterns of thought that I know will be of interest for many people. So have fun, and we'll talk to you again very shortly.
Thanks, Craig.